Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're continuing the conversation that we started a week ago with Mr. John Stacy. He's an AdviCoach franchisee. And if you recall, if you listen to the previous show, he's got a great background in business, over 40 years of being CEO, COO, running businesses, and doing a lot of the things we're talking about. So we're talking about strategic plans, how that's a foundational part of any business. And in the show last week, we talked about facts, the facts that surround whether you do a plan or don't do a plan. Your chances of success, your chances of failure are all affected by whether you do a plan or not. And we hadn't even gotten to the quality of the plan. It's just the fact that you do a plan, right, John?
Absolutely. Interesting, because when we talk about planning and execution, the question that I always have is, what's better, having a bad plan but really execute, or having a really great plan and not being able to execute? So it really comes to me, even if having a plan but being able to execute it is so critical to the business.
Yeah, and I will assume, for the sake of our discussion going forward, that we have what I call a quality plan. It's a plan that it's well done in a sense that it may not make a textbook in a business class at a college level or even a high school level, but the fact is that we put the effort into it, we've thoughtfully gone through it, because every business plan for every business is going to be a bit different, sometimes really different, depending upon all the factors that go into it. We also touched on the culture and why it's so important to build a culture in a business and build the plan to the culture. And then, of course, engage, hire, and train people that fit your culture. So that kind of brings us, I think, to the next step and what we do to build the plan, all the little parts, how it all fits together, how it all works. So let's start off talking about, talk with SWOT. What does that mean?
So a lot of you have probably heard of a SWOT analysis. It's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and trends. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about developing that SWOT and the importance of it. We're also, later on in the segment is going to be talking about the BHAG, your brand promise, as well as your elevator pitch, sandbox, and really financial targets. But that's the basic list of things that we're going to be talking about in this segment. So let's go ahead and go to SWOT.
A lot to talk about, so we need to jump in. This is really the nuts and bolts, right?
Yep.
Well, let's go. Let's talk about it.
So what are your strengths? And so as I talk to business owners, that takes a little bit of time to really think about what their strengths are. But what we're looking at is, what are your talents? What are the capabilities that you and your people in your organization, and it's really the skill sets that you'd like to reinforce and maximize in your business. And those are those things that we're going to build on to really focus on developing a strong organization. The next part is really the weaknesses, which guess what, is generally the opposite of your strengths. Again, do we have gaps in talent? If we have gaps in talent, then we can just start determining what we can do with those gaps. Capabilities, skill set, because those things are going to be barriers to us moving forward. So we have to address those to a degree. The next thing as we're talking, it really is opportunities. What are the most promising? What are the potential that you have that is going to help your organization to actively and aggressively pursue? Okay, so as you look at whatever your product or your service is, what are your opportunities going forward to really maximize your revenue, maximize your profitabilities? Threats. I mean, and a lot of times it's really hard for people to think about what their threats are because we think that we've got this great product and there really is not a lot of threats out there. But what we want to look at, what are the brutal facts facing you and your organization? What's going to happen over the next 12, 24 months? That will have a degree that could impact you, but you've got a degree of control on. So what are some things that could be threats? Depending on where it is, it may be something like automation. Is your product highly manual, but there's automation that's out there? Today, when we look at the unemployment rate, staffing is a threat. What's going to happen to you when we start talking about the gaps, the skill set, those types of things that were our weaknesses or our strengths? What are we going to do with any kind of gap that we can't get people hired? I'm working with a business today that we're having challenges hiring the right kind of people. Well, guess what? We've kind of topped out on the revenue where we can go because we don't have the people to move forward. So we really want to understand what those threats are so that we can start planning and figuring out what do we need to do to address those so that we can continue to have the organization drive forward. And then the last part of the SWOTs are the trends. And so what's happening in your industry? What are emerging trends that are happening in your industry? And this could be challenges, it could be risk, it could be a lot of things. They could be internal things that are happening, or they could be external. But we've got to really be looking at the trends, and I think you can look at a lot of things today. Let's look at the retail environment. Did companies like Sears and J.C. Penney and those companies look 5, 10, 15 years ago and really think about trends that were happening? Look at what's happened to those businesses. You've really got to look at the same thing, because if you don't, there's other companies that are going to come in and be able to take market share away from you, and eventually, if you don't address them, you'll go out of business.
Well, I think the SWOT analysis, like you say, has been around forever, and there's a lot of things. Two things that came up or jumped into my mind when you were talking about it just then, starting with strengths and weaknesses, SWOTT. SWOT is oftentimes when I talk to people, even during the interview process, and I say, well, tell me about your 3 biggest strengths or whatever, people usually, they've got that. And I have found that with business owners. They can talk about the strength of their business, they're proud of it, but then when we say weakness, people have a real hard time, whether it's in an interview or trying to put this analysis together. What's your experience and how do you get around that?
Well, to your point, it's real easy for us to look at ourselves and be intuitive and say, this is what I'm really good at, this is what excites me. And a lot of times that's where the organization goes, because that's where we build our strengths, that's where we feel comfortable. To your point, weaknesses are a challenge. We don't want to admit, especially as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, we don't want to admit that we have any weaknesses. And that in itself is a weakness. And so that goes back to asking questions, really digging down and understanding where they are. And that's where, when you're doing the strategic planning, that you spend the time and dig down and find that out. Because over time, the owner does open up, start thinking about where they are weak, and now that really helps us start putting together a plan to address those so that we're mitigating any of those risks before we even start the company. Or even if you're doing a strategic plan while you've been in business for a while, but you understand and you as a team can address those things.
Yeah, which all makes sense. And one of the things, little tricks I've used with people that are kind of hard-headed, because a lot of times business owners, it's my business, right? And they play from that to some degree. Everyone does. But is to skip over to the first T, threats. And a weakness can be a threat. Not always, but it can be a threat. And you mentioned the employment situation in a current client you're working with, unable to hire people, therefore unable to grow, increase revenues. And I think folks need to remember that. So this is a complete package. Now, on to the OTT, if you will, the opportunity, the threat, the trends, the threats and trends. What that says to me when I'm listening to you is a strategic plan is not done and out. It is something you need to readdress because opportunities, if nothing else, change, threats change, trends change. Doesn't mean also that your strengths and weaknesses might not change, but those 3 are fairly obvious. How often do you recommend the small business who, again, I'm making an assumption today that they're going to produce a quality plan, they're willing to go through this exercise, the 6, 8, 10 hours that you talked about. How often should they readdress the plan and revise it?
Okay, so to answer that question, there's parts of the plan that really should never change. When we start talking about your values, when we start talking about those culture things, to me, those things really shouldn't change. And you're going to spend a lot of time in the first planning process going through that. When you start looking at your SWOT analysis, when you start looking at the rest of this, to me, we ought to be looking at it on an annual basis. Now, you don't have to spend hours and hours and hours doing that because you can go through it, because you can really say, okay, what's changed? Okay, our strengths, some of the weaknesses could have become strengths or vice versa. So there's some things that become relatively easy. That part can happen pretty easily. So, but if we're not looking at that, if we're not always looking forward, then we are going to run into some issues. And as you're talking about those things, I think it's critical then to understand kind of where we go with the process, because we do that on an annual basis. But we take that annual and we take it down to quarterly, and we'll talk about that a little bit once we get into a management action plan in a future segment. But when it comes down to it, there's some things that never change. There's some things we look at on an annual basis, and then we look at some things quarterly.
You know, and my take on this is that I look at all my planning, whether business plan, strategic plan, as part of my annual, I call it annual planning, which includes ultimately my budget, because I'm basing that on assumptions that should be contained in the plans, if you will.
Absolutely.
So at the end of the year, typically, because most folks these days are on calendar year, you've got to set aside some time. And for some business, it's a good time of year to do it. Some it isn't because they're retail or whatever. But you've got to set aside a period of time to walk through this process. And it's definitely with the planning and then in the budget and the other things that go into it. Let's talk about kind of shift directions a little bit. BHAG, you like that word. What does that mean to me as a business owner? What does it really mean? I know what it stands for, but what does that mean?
Well, this is to me an exercise in looking to the future. What do I want to be? So it's your big, hairy, audacious goal. It was something that really Jim Collins and Jerry Porras put together, building your company's vision a number of years ago. And so it's things that we should be looking years out. What's this fantastic thing that we could accomplish? And it's lofty and legendary. Again, it's just to think big, not to think small. And I think I may have mentioned it, but for those of us that were around in the early 60s, JFK had this plan to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Okay, that's legendary. That was thinking something that was never possible, but yet we were able to do it. When you start looking at companies like Walmart in the early 90s, I think they wanted to become $100 million company, and guess what? They achieved that by 2000. I think Nike, interesting. Nike started in the early 60s, and when they started building their company, their BHAG was to crush Adidas. And that made it real obvious to everybody in the company that they had this mission in life. The lofty and legendary goal is to crush Adidas. And in the U.S. anyway, you can say that they have done that. So it really comes down to really having this big goal that we can get everybody pushing towards.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. I read a wonderful interview over the weekend with the engineer, apparently that was in charge of all or some of the rebuilding the Pentagon after 9/11. I don't know if you saw that article, but how they had projected it would take 3 years, and they did it in a year. So I'd say that fits into the BHAG, would you?
Oh, absolutely.
And amazing. And it was redesigned and everything, so it wasn't just putting it back the way it was. So very interesting. Well, anything else about to me, the big, audacious, big, hairy, audacious goal? I got to get that down. BHAG, I got that down. Okay, I'm a business owner, and you say, let's come up with a BHAG. So it's kind of like I sit back in my chair and pull out the snow globe or whatever and kind of stare in there or look out into space and kind of say, gosh, you really got to lead somebody and help them as a mentor advisor to get there, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. But that's part of the fun piece of the strategic planning process. And now the interesting thing is I do work with a charity here, nonprofit in Conroe, and it's Compassion United, and you may have heard them. They've been in existence about 13, 14 years now. And a year and a half ago, I started working with him. And as we were going through this BHAG, he started thinking, wow, what could this be? And his BHAG was to be able to develop this organization to help the homeless get out of homelessness across the U.S. Well, that's huge from little old Conroe, right? Well, the first step of that just is taking place because they now have 5 acres here in the Conroe area to start building out. Today they can serve 17 homeless people, helping them out of homelessness. In the next 5 years, we hope to have this built so that we'll be able to house up to 94 people to help them get out of homelessness. But it's a step, thinking big, and we're moving in that direction. And so having that helps you think, but gets the organization focused on moving that goal. To me, that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it does. I think if nothing else, it should get everybody excited. And I think that's a great word, emotional word, but gets them pointed in the same direction. And having a goal like that in that example, and Nike and all the other examples out there, successful companies all have that kind of goal or vision that they share with everybody that's part of the organization. Well, let's talk about brand promise. I mean, I get different feedback on branding in general. What's your take on it?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call this branding.
Okay.
I would focus more on the promise piece. And it's really about what specific need can your service, your product satisfy for your customers? And we've sometimes talked about, we want to be better. Do you want to be better or good? Do you want to be different? So it really comes down to differentiation. To me, it's more about that. Let's face it, there's a lot of products and services that are out there that are the same. Let's take insurance. I would argue insurance is a commodity. It's all about price, okay? So whoever can sell it at the lowest price is the person that's going to get the sale. That would be the logical thing to talk about, except I'm going to tell you that one of my clients, as an example, really focuses on educating of their clients and providing value. People will pay more for a similar product if they're getting more value out of it. They provide value by education and providing a positive work environment for their employees, but there's a lot of things that they work on to provide value to their clients. So it's about differentiation. So if you're selling a commodity, how do you provide differentiation? How do you communicate that to your clients so that they're willing to spend more? Because it's not always about spending more money. It's about getting a great value for the money you're spending. So that brand promise is all about what's that absolute value, added value proposition that you have to show your value.
And to share. You got to be able to share it, right? Advertise it. Talk about it. What about purpose?
Well, and so I just was thinking about a purpose. So I'm going to kind of go through an example. So there was this woman, she was starting a dog care facility. There's a lot of dog care facilities that are out there. And as she really started looking at what her purpose was, it was really to create a place where people who love their dogs as family members can bring them knowing they are safe, happy, and catered to. No guilt or worries. That was her purpose. Okay? Well, think about all those people that are dog people out there that would know that purpose. And the actions that she did to support her purpose was to create a state-of-the-art dog care environment that embodies my love of dogs. Who would not want to take their dog to someone that loves their clients' dogs? So it really is all about being able to talk about yourself and why you're doing something. Think about the heart. It's all about adding that heart to your company. People buy from people that they know, like, and trust. And by having that heart, it really helps them because you're not selling a product. People are buying from you because of who you are and why you do things.
You make an excellent point, because I think today it's so easy, and it gets more so because in this digital age, we're in this impersonal world where we text, we email, but we don't talk to each other, even over a phone. And the push is on, particularly younger generations, where I was advising a client the other day. I said, pick up the phone and call them, see if that changes, because they were having difficulty with a customer paying their bills. And it consistently sent the email, sent this, and it wasn't working. I said, try a phone call, and so on and so forth. And I said, or go by there. In fact, if you want me to go, I'll go with you, and just stand there. But anyway, the point being is a change. It's funny. In the very beginning of my career, involved in a family business, and we were in the cleaning business, dry cleaning, and did alterations, this and that. And the profile of the person that we wanted, the ideal person to work at the counter in those days, and this is a long time ago, I'm telling you, but within the company was a woman, typically over the age of 40, 45, because the perception, and there were a few other qualities, but the perception by the public was that they'll take care of my clothes. And there was a connection to mom and so on and so forth. And those kind of people did a better job, had higher increases in revenue, faster increase. I mean, it just worked better, assuming they were a quality individual and all those other things. But when you put me behind the counter, and I'm 18 or 20 or 25, young guy, even though I knew everything inside and out, and I smiled, and I knew it just wasn't the same thing on a one-on-one basis. So people need to think about that in their business, and the kind of people that particularly interact interact with the client customer. It's very important and can have a real positive effect. Doesn't mean I couldn't take care of a customer, but they didn't perceive that. So
it goes back to really talking about the brand promise again, and setting expectations and being able to communicate that value. And right people, right place, doing the right thing at the right time.
Yeah, and that needs to click every day, and that's a challenge for a lot of folks, and I get it. Well, let's talk briefly. We've got a couple, 3 minutes left. Elevator pitch, 60-second commercial. Isn't that overdone?
No. And the fact of the matter is, it's overdone badly. I mean, there's a lot of people that will talk about themselves. This is what I do. Okay, this isn't about talking about yourselves. It's about being able to engage and connect and be able to communicate that I can help. Or working together, we can solve your problem. It's not about me. It's always about you. And so a lot of times elevator pitches are just not done particularly well. That I would agree with. But I think it's key. And the other thing is I've run into, it's only the salespeople that do elevator pitches. No. Every one of your employees needs to be able to do an elevator pitch. They need to be able to talk about how we can help you. We all have different people, different groups of people that we know. We should all be talking to them. And it's not sales. We're all sales. So, but it needs to be done well, and it's not about me. It's about you.
Yeah, and it's a great point. I've used the elevator pitch, even though folks will kind of shy away, but is to leverage it and work with people to determine, going back to the brand promise and so on and so forth. Let's tell people what you're doing. So now we're going to verbalize, and it's a great exercise, if nothing else. Well, financial targets. I mean, those are obviously, that's the measuring.
Yeah, and that's in the next segment. We're going to talk about really how to do those measurements, because there's financial planning, but there's also KPIs, and I think that we need to understand. And the financial targets are really the financial piece. This is my P&L, my cash flow statements, those types of things, my balance sheet. It's really being able to put those things together, 3 to 5. But we do a 3 to 5 year, a 1 year, and then a quarterly plan. And those are critical. That's part of that business plan that needs to be done on an annual basis as we kind of review and tweak the strategic plan.
Well, and I'll offer this to people based on my experiences working with people and listening to other folks that do what John does, I do. So many small business people really don't pay any or very little attention to this financial piece. They don't get their financials, their profit and loss, at least on a monthly basis. And if they do, they don't look at it. And 9 times out of 10, my experience is it's always late. Now, what does late mean? Maybe 30 days after the close of the month. I mean, they don't get it. And it's sad, because getting accurate numbers on a timely basis can help you if you'll take the time to understand them and learn them. And there are people such as your CPA or accountant that can teach you to read them, and there are plenty of courses online and whatever. Then you can use those to make better decisions.
And you're right. It's amazing how many people don't even know that they have a P&L. It's amazing that they don't look at them on a monthly basis. It's amazing to me that you can manage anything or manage a business and not have that information available. How do you make decisions? I can't do it. If I don't have that, that's a challenge.
And if you don't have it on a timely basis, because information gets old every second after that's like snapshot in time. It gets older and older and older, so you got to get it in a reasonable period of time. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of part 2 of strategic planning, building a strong foundation. John, if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do it?
Probably the best way to get in touch with me is to text me, JSTACY at 80800. So that's text JSTACY at 80800.
Well, thank you again, John, and I look forward to continuing our conversation next week on part 3 as we complete the soup to nuts conversation, strategic planning, building a strong foundation.
OneBestConsult.com, a community of small business owners where you as an owner can find answers to the most pressing business questions you have. Not sure who to turn to when you have a challenge in your business? Turn to the folks at OneBestConsult.com. That's the number 1, bestconsult.com, where you can always find advice you can use based on common sense business experience. Join our community of like-minded business owners at onebestconsult.com.